Well, hello, and welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I am Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Today, we continue the great conversation we started 2 weeks ago, all about the digital experience composition, also known as DXC, with my special guest presenter and, full disclosure, my boss that I report to, Adam Conn, VP of Enablement at Uniform. But before we get started, real quick, let me tell you about headlesscreator.com. Go get your free account. You'll have access to, obviously, this interview we're about to have on demand later, but you also have access to the entire course, the Discover Headless Tech course, which includes tons of tutorials. You see, we have lots of them coming up, lots of podcast episodes, bonus material, a bunch of stuff. And of course, you're going to have access to pretty much everything else on the site, including Content Modeling Weekly, this course, the retrospective, which first episode goes live on November 10th, I believe. We got a couple of weekly tip courses, a whole bunch of Headless CMS courses. We've got 3 boot camps. We're about to launch a brand new series. Man, we're just launching tons of series here. You're going to love it. So get your free account. It won't cost you anything except your time and your email. That's it, but you'll get lots in return. All right, with that said, you know how this works. We're going to get Adam in here in just a second, but quick reminder, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll ask Adam. With that said, Adam, welcome.
Good morning, Marcelo. It's nice to be back.
Good morning. Glad to have you back here. It is morning. For those of you watching around the world, we're in the west coast of the United States. You are where, Adam?
Portland, Oregon.
I'm in Southern California, so it's pretty early for us, but glad to have you back here. I typically start with tell us about your background, but people can go to part 1 and learn all about that. So what I like usually to do for part 2 is I like to ask a little bit more personal stuff, like what are you into? What's your hobby?
Oh, hobbies. So yeah, having a startup doesn't leave a whole lot of time for hobbies.
That's your hobby, the startup.
Yeah, but there is one thing that I always try to make time for, and that's going for bike rides with my wife. Not racing or anything, just recreational riding around town. She got an e-bike earlier this year, and it's really changed the way that we ride. It's a little hilly out here. I like the hills, but my wife's short. She's got short legs, so it's harder for her to get up the hills than it is for me. So this has really been like the great equalizer. We can ride a lot farther and longer than we were in the past. So I'm definitely a huge advocate for e-bikes. If you haven't tried one, I can't recommend it enough.
I haven't. I've seen a couple of people on it. So are you at really, and this is a genuine question. I'm not trying to be funny or sarcastic, but are you really riding? Like, are you doing exercising, or is it almost like a moped, from the 80s?
Yeah, there are different kinds, but the kind that she has, it's pedal assist. So you do have to move the pedals, but then when you do that, it like gives you a boost. It's a really weird kind of sensation at first, but it allows you to exert yourself as much as you want or as little as you want.
Okay. So it's like you said, it's an assist versus it's a motor running all the time. Does it self-charge as you're using it, or no, you have to charge it at night?
You have to charge it. It holds a charge for quite a while, so she doesn't have to charge it after every ride, but every couple of weeks she brings it in and charges it up.
And I'm assuming if you lose the battery, basically you can continue riding it just like a regular bike.
Yeah, a real heavy regular bike.
A real heavy regular bike, yeah. Well, that's
that's one of those mistakes that people make once. They don't judge their charging properly, and then it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and how long does it hold the charge for? I mean, like how many miles can you go?
It's I want to say hers is maybe 150-mile range. It's way farther than we would ever
most
ride.
People would travel. Yeah, exactly. Okay, very cool. All right, so let's get started. Real quick, we covered a lot of stuff in part 1. People can go watch part 1, and we talked a lot about what DXC is, marketing, the information behind that, terminology. We gave a whole overview. We left off with the 3 types of DXC, but before we jump into that, maybe you can give just a real quick, for those new viewers, a real quick summary of what is DXC, then we'll jump into the 3 types.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to try to be brief, but it's not something that's super easy to
Right.
describe briefly. But so DXC is digital experience composition. It's a kind of product that lets you build and maintain digital experiences with headless or composable architectures. So digital experience can be like websites or email campaigns and mobile apps, those sorts of things. But the problem that it solves is that with composable architecture, you've got all these individual systems that are responsible for a specific thing, whether that's managing content, like what a CMS does, or product information, which is what a PIM does, or digital assets, which is what a DAM does, segmenting visitors, which is what a CDP does, and so on. There's all these different systems. And that's really the point of a composable architecture. So you get to use a bunch of different products because we've really tried the one size fits all approach and it just doesn't work. But when you have all these different systems, how do you make sure that they're able to work together? How are they connected? How are certain tasks that span multiple systems handled? And these are really big challenges when you have a composable architecture. And something like digital experience management, they're especially big problems because in the past, when you had like a monolithic system, you only noticed these problems when you needed to integrate an external system with the monolith. So you already had all of these problems solved because that's what the monolith did for you. But with a composable architecture, you don't have a solution to these problems. You have to create the solution yourself. So that's really what DXC is. DXC is the solution to these problems. And it's a product that makes these different systems, all of these different individual composable products work together specifically so that you can build and maintain digital experiences.
So monolith wise, can a monolith be part of a DXC? So just another portion of that DXC system. Let's say in an enterprise that has a monolith and maybe they bring on a headless CMS as well.
Yeah, so it is possible, and that's where you kind of have to make the distinction between DXC as a product and DXC as a concept. As a concept, it's something that's just able to make these different systems work together, and it has to have certain features or certain capabilities, and we got into those in depth in the first part. But if you can provide those capabilities, then you basically have a DXC. Now, a DXC as a product, which is more what we're talking about, is something that you don't get automatically, and you're probably not, if you're an enterprise and you already have some systems that provide some of the capabilities that a DXC provides, you probably don't have a DXC because there are a variety of reasons, a variety of different limitations of those systems, which is why there wasn't a solution until these DXCs came about and started specifically solving those problems.
Right. Do you find that the industry is slowly starting to just label? Because I found that with headless CMS and a whole API first, companies that didn't really offer that started label themselves as that, just because hey, it's a marketing term. So how can we make sure that companies are aware of what truly is a DXC and what is just a company putting a label on it so they can sell more?
Yeah, that's kind of a perennial problem with commercial software, is that there's this marketing aspect, and when there is a new buzzword or something, people are quick to pick up on it. I think
Right.
there's one organization that is helping in this, and that's the Mac Alliance. And we talked about what Mac is and Mac Alliance also in the
Mm-hmm.
first part, but they're an advocacy group, and one of the things that they do is they certify products. Now they don't have a certification for DXC, but they do have certification for Mach that you have to follow these certain principles and these certain design patterns in order to get the certification. So they're sort of a somewhat neutral arbiter, and somebody that you can go to, and they're trying to prevent what they call as mock washing or Mac washing, which is sort of like whitewashing, and where companies that maybe have some composable capabilities, but then also have this legacy of very non-composable products come in and start calling themselves composable. So they're there kind of as a voice to say, hold on, just because you've done, this one little piece doesn't negate all of this other stuff that you're actually selling to your customers and that your customers are actually using.
Right, right. So let's talk about the three types of DXEs, and maybe you can give a breakdown of what are the components that enterprises should be looking at when they're looking at these three types.
Yeah, so there are these three types, and maybe what I can do is kind of just describe each of the three types, and then get into like the advantages and disadvantages of each. And I think
Yeah.
that should give us a kind of a starting point if we wanted to go a little deeper on this. So the three, just let me name them first, and then I'll go into more detail. First one is DXP, Digital Experience Platform. The second is Headless CMS, and the third are Pure Play. And these are the three types that Gartner is the analyst firm that created this category, that named this. So this is the way that they view DXPs that are available today, kind of the categories that they see within the category of DXC, digital experience composition. So these are like the three different approaches that a vendor who is offering DXC functionality can go about actually offering it. So first one is DXP, the digital experience platform. So if you think of what a digital experience platform is, and again, we talked about this in part one, but it sounds kind of similar to what DXC, the digital experience composition, is. And I mentioned this at the top, but a DXC is a product that lets you build and manage digital experiences in a composable stack. A DXP, the digital experience platform, is like a self-contained product that lets you build and manage digital experiences. So architecture-wise, DXP, the platform, is either a monolith, meaning all the functionality like content management and asset management and content delivery, all of that stuff is included in a single product. That's what a monolith is. So an example of a monolith is the Sitecore Experience Platform. So that's one traditional architecture for a DXP, digital experience platform. The other is a product suite. And a product suite is a collection of separate products from a single vendor. And that's the approach that Adobe takes with the Adobe Experience Manager. So if you're a vendor with a DXP, the digital experience platform, the idea here is you could sort of refactor your products so the experience management functionality works with other products, with like composable products like a headless CMS or a PIM. And in Gartner's research, they identified a few vendors here. Bloomreach and Crown Peak are two examples of vendors who offer DXP, digital experience platform, but also their DXP can be thought of as a DXC.
So real quick on that. So how do they make it a DXC? By offering APIs that you can use to connect to other systems? I mean, I'm trying to grasp how this DXP monolith or suite can now be called a DXC. What makes it available to do that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's mostly a matter of opening up, kind of unlocking some of the functionality
Right.
that they had tightly coupled within their own monolith or their own system. So something like content management, just something as fundamental to digital experience management as content management. With a DXP, a digital experience platform, you get a CMS built in, and that's
Right.
the CMS you use. So when you go in and if you're building a web experience and you want to create a new page, you're using whatever sort of modeling or templating engine that the DXP provides. You're creating a new content object using whatever data model they have,
Right.
and you create it. In order for a DXP then to become a DXC, the idea is that you would be able to redirect that. So instead of pointing to the DXP's built-in CMS, you would be able to
You
point
attach.
to another
Right.
CMS.
Okay. That makes sense.
So that's the DXP, the digital experience platform approach. The second kind is the headless CMS. So even though headless CMS was originally envisioned as a pure form of content management that isn't tied to a specific channel like the web, the reality is that the overwhelming majority of headless
It's tied to
CMS
the web, yeah.
yeah, that's what they're used for, managing
Right.
web content. And headless CMS vendors have felt pressure from their customers and also from their investors to offer some sort of experience building capabilities. So this is the idea that you've got the DXC functionality that is growing out of a need of a headless content management system. And in this category or this type of DXC, Gartner identified like Amplience and Contentful and Content Stack as offering this.
So just to be clear, so it started as a headless CMS, but then it expanded into allowing the connection of other systems into it. That makes it a DXC or a
Yes,
type of DXC.
yes, and that kind of I guess you could get somewhat philosophical about this, whether it's um, adding functionality to the headless CMS, or that the CMS is hooking into this other functionality that they've
Right.
created. I think the way to think about it that's a little bit more in line with the aspirations of DXC is that they are separate things, that the DXC is one thing. It serves its purpose of facilitating the creation and management of digital experiences. And then a headless CMS is just one of many systems that will feed into it.
Got it. Okay.
So that's the coming from the headless CMS approach. And then the third way that Gartner has identified the ability to provide this DXC functionality is pure play. And the pure play vendors are the ones who built this functionality specifically to solve the problems that we were talking about how do you get these systems to work together.
And obviously we're like one of them, uniform.
Yeah, that's exactly where Gartner puts uniform.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So advantages and disadvantages of each of these, I think it can be helpful to understand.
Well, let's expand on the pure play a little bit. Just give us examples of what makes it a pure play, right? We know with the headless, it kind of grew from the headless and expanded, but what makes us and anybody else in this category a pure play DXC?
Yeah, well, that's quite literally the distinction between pure play and both the headless CMS approach and the DXP approach. Those other approaches grew out of something else. Something already existed, and there was more functionality that was built in order to support what DXC requires. What pure play does and how pure play is different is the pure play vendors identified that there's actually a unique and specific problem that doesn't grow out of something that already exists, but is separate from those products that already exist. So they look at the problem and say, how are business users going to be able to build digital experiences when part of their work is happening in a headless CMS, part of their work is happening in some sort of a commerce system? You can look at that and say, well, why don't we expand the CMS to be able to provide hooks into the commerce system? Or why don't we expand the commerce system to provide hooks into the headless CMS? The pure play vendors looked at that problem and said, well, no, we're not a headless CMS. We're not a commerce system. There's a need from both directions for this functionality. So we're going to solve this problem because it is its own problem.
Right. And it seems to me that the big difference from a development perspective between pure play and DXP and headless is that, to me, it seems like DXP and headless type category, you're still tightly coupling, even though you can connect to others, you're still tightly coupling them through whatever code SDK they provide. Where in a pure play, you're very, very decoupled, meaning that you can switch your connections fairly easy, right? It's never easy, but much easier than the other two categories. Am I wrong in that assessment, or?
I don't think that you're wrong with that. I would, putting myself in the shoes of maybe a vendor who is either a headless CMS or a DXP vendor, I might not describe it that way as being tightly coupled.
Okay.
Which I think there could be some argument about, but I think something that is a little less hard to argue is that, with the pure play vendors have to support multiple other vendors. They have to, because a DXC without these underlying systems is useless. And that's not the case with the DXP or with the headless CMS. With both of those products, you still can do things and you can still get work done. So the question with the first two options is how truly portable or how compatible are those options with other competing products? So you've got to, in both cases, in the DXP case and the headless CMS case, I think the question comes down to, well, what if you want to use a different CMS? Are you able to do that with the DXC that comes from the DXP world or from the headless CMS world? And it may be possible. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I haven't been hands-on with those kinds of products, But that's the question I would ask.
Well, and I think I love what you said, because I think that really, to me, in my mind at least, it describes the distinction between pure play and non-pure play, where the pure play, it's all about connecting to everybody, right? Because that's the whole point of it. I mean, without everybody else, the pure play is nothing, right, by itself. Where the others, at the end of the day, they want you to stay with whatever that system is, and then we'll help you connect just because we don't want to lose you. So I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, because business is business, but I think that, to me, in my mind, that's the real distinction between a pure play and the other types, where the pure play, we exist, or the pure play exists mainly to support every vendor out there. That's the whole idea.
Yes, and to be fair with pure play, that is the potential. I would say that's the potential. Yeah. Will the reality meet that? Will every pure play vendor really be equal for all of the connections that they provide? Probably not. I mean, everybody has to pick and choose, and as time goes on, there will be alliances that are made, and some like that book, Animal Farm, about all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I think that sort of thing will probably play out even with the pure play vendors. But I do completely agree that what the pure play vendors have that the other two options don't really have is a much stronger motivation to have open functionality in terms of DXC, and to make it possible to switch out any component that's in a composable architecture, not just most of them.
Right. And this is my question wasn't really meant to put down the other two categories. They're all very important, but from an enterprise point of view, depending on what you need to do, and if you're looking at switching constantly, you might want to look at a pure play versus a non-pure play. So, but just something to keep in mind. At the end of the day, if it helps you get your business done, then you're going to go for what you're going to go for. So,
yeah. And I think that's, on some of the advantages that, the advantage of the DXP, if you already have that DXP and you want to expand out and you want to be able to use some other systems, maybe you're not thinking about wanting to replace the CMS that's a part of the DXP, but you do want it to be easier to incorporate some commerce systems. Mm-hmm. Well, in that case, it could make a lot of sense to look at your DXP as offering the DXC functionality, because it's going to make it easier for you to bring in other systems. Maybe certain parts of the system you're not going to replace, or you can't replace, or it's not easy to replace, but that's fine, because that's not your motivation. Your motivation is to look beyond the core of the DXP, and that there's a bigger world than the DXP, and this makes it easier to bring those in.
Right. Yeah.
I think the headless CMS approach is a little more risky, and it's a little harder for me to find great benefit for the customer from that approach, if the customer is interested in composability and really sees the value in what composability is about, which is flexibility, and is about not being locked into a particular vendor. Because from the headless CMS world, when they start getting into like DXC and experience building, now they're going beyond their core competence, and they're starting to do everything that they've spent the last several years railing against the monolithic vendors for doing. Starting to do more than what they really understood and really were good at, and starting to do a lot of other things because they need to, but not doing those all that well. And also the idea of being locked in, and of really having a single system be the center of your composable architecture. Should the center of your architecture, your composable architecture, really be your headless CMS? Is there something about the headless CMS that's so fundamentally important and different than the other components of your composable architecture that it deserves this special place at the middle? And are you okay with building everything off of that?
Right. And that's a big question that an enterprise needs to ask. Do you foresee with as the category, the DXC category evolves, do you foresee standards? Because you mentioned getting stuck with one vendor, right? But we, playing devil's advocate, you could say the same thing about, well, I'm now stuck with this particular DXC vendor, right? And now I have to do everything. Do you foresee any standards coming out of this category where it'll evolve and then all DXCs will try to follow that standard, or not really?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of optimism in that happening. Just I've been in the industry long enough and
Yeah.
have seen
I
this
mean, I
sort
knew
of
the
thing.
answer, but I just had to ask it.
Yeah, I think that there are some things that will keep vendors somewhat honest. I mentioned the Mac Alliance as being one that could play a role here, and I think the analysts. I mean, the analysts. That's what they were doing with DXP,
Hmm.
and keeping defining what a DXP is and making sure that that everybody in the industry understood when they said DXP, this is what they meant. And it sort of creates a de facto standard where if you are going to try to claim to be a DXP and you're not, you're going to get called out quickly and you're going to have to change how you're describing what you're doing.
Yep. Yep. Cool. All right. Let's switch a little bit and go into they're convinced, the enterprise is convinced, I want to acquire it. So let's switch into sort of that category of questions that I wanted to ask you. And we kind of covered this, but what should companies specifically look for? Let's get it a little bit more specific when they want a DXC.
Yeah. So, first of all, I would say I feel like this is important to say that there aren't a lot of companies that are probably researching DXC per se, just because it's such a new category. It's just not very well known, but they're definitely researching solutions to the problems that DXC solves.
Right.
So, educating the market that there's actually a product category that they should be looking at. That's what those of us in this space put a lot of energy into. But the DXC itself is a defined category. So there are certain things that a product really needs to have in order to be considered a DXC. So these are the things that they should be looking for. We talked about these last time, but quickly, there are these 3 layers in the DXC. At the bottom, there's this API framework, which is largely pre-built connectors to different systems that are provided and maintained by the DXC vendor themselves. On top of that, there's the experience building tools. So these are like the no-code tools, low-code tools that let business users create digital experiences using content and data and functionality that's exposed through that bottom layer, the API framework. And on top of that, there is this front-end orchestration layer. So this is something else that they should be looking for. The purpose of this is to let developers access everything from those bottom 2 layers. And it also makes it possible for the digital experience to be delivered to customers. So, to try to be a little more specific about what companies should look for, I think there's a couple of things that come to my mind. First is you want to look for support for the systems that you intend to use. And you can come at this from a couple of different directions, I think. One is kind of the obvious one, are there connectors available? If you're using a specific headless CMS and a specific CDP, you're looking at a vendor who's offering you a DXC solution. Is there a connector that's available? So DXC vendor might be able to add new connectors quickly, or they might offer like an SDK so that you can build custom connectors. So the fact that a system isn't supported today shouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker, but you do want to look to see what connectors are available, and if there aren't connectors available, what's it going to take in order to get a connector built? And then another thing I think that you want to think about is whether the connector does what you need it to do. And this is something that those of us who have worked with integration and have worked with connectors in this space for a while know about and are constantly trying to get people to really ask the next question, because it's really easy to ask like a vendor, do you have a connector for this particular system? They give you the answer, yes. Then you move on to the next thing. But just because you have a connector doesn't mean that it's actually going to give you the kind of functionality that you need in order to use it the way that you want to use it. So if you want to read images from a CMS, as an example, but the connector only gives you access to text content, it doesn't give you access to the actual image itself, that could be a problem for you. So it's not just whether the connector exists, but what does the connector do?
Well, and I would argue even how often do they maintain it? So in other words, let's say they have a connector to a headless CMS, and now there's a new version of that headless CMS with new functionality. That connector has to be updated to be able to access that functionality, right?
Yes, but again, to try to keep in mind, do you actually need that functionality? Because products, vendors are constantly adding new features to their systems, and a lot of times you will want to be able to take advantage of that. But sometimes, if you're just trying to pull in some images from a dam, do you also need to incorporate the ability to do image rescaling directly in the DXC tool? Is that something that somebody who's creating a digital experience, does that person really need that functionality, or is it okay to leave that functionality in the source system? Because again, one of the things that the DXC is trying to do, which makes it very different than the approach that the DXP, the digital experience platform, did, is the DXC is not trying to hide the fact that there are multiple systems involved in the background. It's just trying to make it easier for business users and developers and everybody involved to be productive when you have functionality split across multiple systems.
Right. Okay.
So the other thing I think that people should be looking for is, what is the user experience, and making sure, and this is especially important for business users, making sure that the user experience matches your expectations. So what I mean by this one is that one of the main responsibilities of a DXC is to enable the business users to build and maintain digital experience. So what it means to be user friendly for one business user or one organization may not be user friendly for another. And if you're coming from a traditional CMS or a DXP platform, you might have certain expectations on what the user experience is like having integrated content authoring and experience composition. So in a traditional CMS or DXP, when you're creating a web page, you're able to go in and actually edit the content that's appearing in the web page directly at the same time that you're creating the web page. Now, there are cases where that's very useful functionality, and there are cases where that is actually not very useful functionality, even though that may seem kind of counterintuitive, especially with larger organizations where they are creating content that's multi-channel content in their CMS.
Right.
Now, right, you're starting to edit it within the context of a particular channel, but you don't realize that content is being used in other channels as well. So can you really edit it the way that you should be editing it? But that's an example. Can you simultaneously edit the content and do content management and experience composition in the same tool? If you're coming from a traditional CMS or DXP, that might be your expectation. So then when you see how a DXC works, you may think that you're taking a step back. So on that, I would just urge people to kind of be open-minded as you learn about your options, because some things will work differently. And this can be good and bad. This can open opportunities for new and more efficient ways to work. But it also could be disruptive, and every organization is going to need to figure out for itself, is it trying to replicate their current experience as much as possible, or is it possible that maybe there's a better way to work? And is the DXC that they're looking at, is that a tool that's going to help them create a better way to work, or to make their users more productive and efficient?
So you said keep an open mind and maybe be a little disruptive. Can you expand a little bit? If I mean, we're at 35 minutes already, which is unbelievable, but maybe expand a little bit. What do you mean by it will be different than, let's say you mentioned a bit different than a DXP from we're talking about, but when we say the user experience, we're talking about the content author, right? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
What do you mean it's a little bit different? Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. So I think I think the one example that really comes to mind is just, again, this idea of content authoring and digital experience composition, and creating the digital experience are really two separate tasks that in the DXP world were often put together. So in a traditional DXP, what you often had were multiple interfaces for being able to edit content. You could do it through like a form-based or a tree-based interface, which is just focusing on the content. This is the information, this is the data, this is what I'm entering in. I don't know how it's going to appear on a web page or wherever, but it doesn't matter,
Right.
because I'm just trying to create information about a new
You're
promotion.
maintaining a product or a promotion. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But then they also would have this WYSIWYG interface that would allow you to build the page and pull content in from different places. That experience doing that would often also allow you to actually edit the content in the context of the web page. So you could go in, and if there was a word that was misspelled, you would be able to go into the DXC and change the word right then and there.
Got it.
In the DXP. So in the world of the DXC, you may or may not have that functionality because it's not a part of the definition of what a DXC is. A DXC identifies that a content management system is where that information should be edited and managed. And the DXC is where you're building digital experiences. So if you're coming at the problem as, oh, I'm used to doing this all in one tool, and that's how I want to work, you may be faced with a situation where if you want to change the content, you're going back over to the CMS in order to change the content, as opposed to you're creating a web page. I'm going to change this content directly in the web page. Now, the DXC may make it easy for you to get over to the CMS. You could click a link, and then that takes you directly to the content object that you want to edit, which I think is actually a good solution because it falls in with the idea or the sort of philosophy of composability, which is again that you're not trying to hide the fact that there are multiple systems involved. You are letting the user know that this is not the right tool for you to be editing content, but we're going to make it as easy as possible for you to get over to that tool to be able to edit the content.
Right. Well, and I think this is the same problem with that I ran into many times with content modeling, which is I think part of it is also retraining authors into a new way of thinking and a new way of managing content. So it sounds to me that if you are bringing a DXC and you want to do it the old-fashioned way, as you mentioned, where you edit everything on the page, you may also want to reconsider retraining, which also falls on us in the industry to have to push a lot of education to show the benefits of doing it a different way, right, than the old traditional way where you're changing it on the web page. Because as the metaverse expands, and one day I believe that metaverse will take off, you're going to have different channels where you want to update all of this content, and changing things in the context of a web page is not going to make any more sense in the future, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that, and that's why I kind of described it as being open-minded,
Right.
but also kind of understanding what the parameters are for your organization. If any sort of change is just too disruptive for your business users, then that's okay. Just go into it and recognize that this is going to steer you in the direction of maybe a certain kind of product, and there may be some compromises, and that's perfectly fine. This holy grail of composability and all of the benefits that you can get from composability, it does come at a price. You do have these different systems involved, and if the idea of having to work in multiple systems and deal with multiple systems in any way is just not something that you're interested in, then that's okay. You can still get some benefits of composability, but maybe those benefits of composability aren't so compelling to you.
Right. Well, you mentioned price, which leads me to my next question. And obviously, we're not going to talk about exact cost, but what should companies today, this is going to evolve because it's such a new category that things will change. We've seen that in the headless CMS industry. But today, what should companies expect to pay? And I don't mean exact cost, but should they expect to pay by user fees? How is the cost going to be handled with the DXC?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different ways that this could be done. I would expect pricing to be based on things, at least initially, that are pretty easy and straightforward to measure. So, things like number of sites and number of pages, because really the initial use case for a lot of this is pretty web centric. Mm-hmm. But there are also things like the number of components, number of users, number of domains, number of connectors that you're using. Those seem like the most obvious things to be a basis for a license, and they're easy to measure.
Right. And I'm sure things will evolve, right? As customers start complaining about why you charging me for this, then things will start changing. That happened in the headless CMS industry, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. So obviously DXC, DXP, everything we spoke about is cloud-based. I mean, that's the whole point of Mog, right? It's all cloud-based. But what about for companies that are very security sensitive, where they go, no, we can't put stuff in the cloud? Is there currently today DXCs, or do you foresee in the future more self-hosted DXCs?
Yeah, so there's no reason why a DXC couldn't be self-hosted, but I imagine most of them are going to be SaaS. Most of the headless and composable
Sure.
the like the headless and composable products that get connected using a DXC are SaaS. So it seems to be that that's a model that organizations are comfortable with. Um, it's possible that a DXC could store sensitive data, but that's not a requirement. A DXC actually doesn't have to store any data at all. It can just store pointers to data, and the connectors can resolve the pointers when they need to. But they can access the system of record directly, so they don't need to bring the data into the DXC in order to use it. So, if security is a concern, that's the sort of approach I think you'd be looking for.
I think it's important that you pointed out, no pun intended, that in general, DXCs will store pointers. And so there is no issue with security there, right? Because then it becomes the issue of how is it stored in those original systems, right?
Yeah, because we really have gotten past the point of needing to bring data into one system in order for you to be able to use that data. And that's, DXCs with having connectors. I mean, it's possible that a DXC could basically import the content that you want to use in a digital
Yeah.
experience into the DXC. But I would hope that the people who are building DXC functionality know better than to kind of go down that road, because again, that's another road that we've tried in the past, and it doesn't work. It doesn't scale. It's complicated to
It doesn't
maintain.
support single source of truth because
Yeah,
things can get out of sync, right?
yeah.
Exactly. Cool. So if an enterprise wants to bring in a DXC, what are the roles, the people that should be involved in figuring out which DXC, the functionality that they're looking for to solve, the problem that they're looking to solve in the enterprise?
Yeah, so someone who's like the head of digital marketing is probably going to be the most interested in DXC, but it affects marketing, development, commerce teams, IT teams, all of these teams pretty equally. So they all should be involved, because it's like I mentioned earlier, it does provide its functionality, but it can't do anything without connecting different systems. So anybody who's working with those different systems, they can be affected by this.
Got it. So now we're going to jump in a little bit and we're going to go through this rather quickly because we're at 45 minutes here. But we've got the DXC in the organization. Now we have the reality of managing this DXC. Do you recommend, like I recommend having a content architect for content modeling organization if you really want to scale? Do you recommend that they would be sort of a DXC administrator taking care of, not taking care of the headless CMS and all the other systems, but that system itself?
Yeah, there would be. I mean, maybe it's not a dedicated role, but a DXC is a product. So, like any other system, that it would need to be administered. So I would see this role as being responsible for things like configuring the connections to the different content and data sources, and managing users who have access to it, and setting up roles and permissions.
Well, you mentioned users. That's so another question that I personally have is you have users in a headless CMS, you have users in a PIM, you have users in a DAM, blah, blah, blah. Do you recreate all these users in a DXC, or is this single sign-on? How the actual implementation of that? How does that work?
Yeah, so it depends on the DXC, but support for single sign-on and third-party authentication services, those are common way to reduce the number of logins a person needs to have. So I think that's probably going to be the most common solution that organizations take advantage of.
Got it. Now, one of the powers of DXCs is all these connectors we spoke about. Do developers have to build preview pages that show, because at the end of the day, you're bringing all this content, right? The author is bringing all this content, and now they want to preview. We did talk about re-educating them into, don't worry about what it looks like because that's the channel. But the reality at the end of the day is, yeah, that's cool, but I want to know what it looks like, so show me. So do DXCs support previews? And if they do, are developers still involved in that? How does that process work?
Yeah, so the DXC may or may not provide a preview, and it kind of depends on what it is that you're composing. Are you composing an abstract experience where the user is able to say, well, this is the content that I want to use. It doesn't matter to me what it looks like. Sort of the way that, like, the abstraction that somebody who's using a headless CMS has to do. If the headless CMS either doesn't have preview or doesn't have preview set up. You could have a DXC that handles it that way. But what a much more common, and I think is going to end up being a much more popular approach, is having some sort of context preview where you take an application and you're able to preview the experience through that application. Because ultimately, at the top layer of the DXC is that front-end orchestration layer. That's where everything comes together. So being able to build that front end and have it hook into the DXC so that you can preview content seems like it's gonna end up being, if not an actual requirement, something that if you don't offer it, you're not going to have a very compelling product available.
Yeah. We spoke about a lot of stuff. One thing we didn't touch upon is personalization. Should that be part of the DXC, or is personalization just another system like a DAM, like a headless CMS, like a PIM?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because Gartner's definition of DXC actually doesn't require personalization, but personalization is one of these things that is a feature that can fit into DXC because of what DXC actually does. It's letting you manage digital experiences, and personalization is an important part of a modern digital experience. So if you're going in and the DXC is allowing you to create a component that's going to have information on a promotion, that is the point that it would make sense to configure personalization, to say that this segment of users should see this promotion, or this if the visitor is coming from this part of the country, that they should see this other promotion. So it feels like a natural part of a DXC, but it's not a stated part of the DXC. I would also add like testing and experimentation features in here too. That's pretty similar in a lot of ways to what you're trying to do with personalization. You've got a different experience that you want to present in different cases. So if a DXC is going to include like personalization and experimentation features, they're probably going to be integrated into that no-code tool that the business users use, because that's where the experiences are composed. But if the DXC doesn't include personalization, you can still use personalization, but then you're probably going to be configuring the personalization from outside of the DXC, like in a separate tool, like something you do with Google Optimize.
Do you think, from a pure play perspective, that personalization should be just another tool that you can connect? Or do you feel, because it's so tied to that no-code tool, that it really DXCs, I'm asking basically for your personal opinion here, that DXC should build it as part of it because they're building that no-code tool as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I'm going to give you a kind of a wishy-washy and unsatisfying answer. I don't think that it's necessary. I think that what has always been the most exciting and appealing part of composability to me is that it gives allowances to what different organizations need and gives you some flexibility in how you can solve problems. So to go in and say that the DXC, that it's best for personalization to be provided by the DXC, sort of ignores that there are some real use cases where you might not want to do that. I mean, if you're already using something like Google Optimize, you're familiar with it, you're happy with it, and you want to continue using it, why should the DXC force you to use a different approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. It wasn't wishy-washy. I think you had any opinion there. Okay, cool. We're pretty much at the end here. But so I'm going to end it with this. With monoliths, one of the big benefits is my website went down. I called the monolith and go, it's your fault. You're down. Fix it. With DXC, composability, all this, where you're depending on multiple vendors, what happens? Who do you contact? Who's I don't want to use the word blame, right? But how do you get help as an enterprise? Who do you call when something goes down? And you may not know why, because it could be 3 layers down, right, from another system using another system. What happens there? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah. So who are you going to call? But, yeah, so this is a challenge with a composable architecture for sure, but I'm really not sure it's as big a challenge as some people might think that it is. So the argument is that when you have a monolithic system, you have like this one throat to choke, and that's definitely true. But the monolith is also like a black box, and fixing one part of the system requires updating the entire system, which can be really time consuming and expensive. With the DXC, you're letting the DXC handle the connections to the different systems. So if you have a problem with like a connectivity, the DXC vendor should help you resolve that. But other issues, especially ones that may not be obviously related to connectivity, those really need to be handled on a case-by-case basis. But I will say that you have a very high level of transparency with a composable architecture. You know exactly how the systems are connected and how they interact. So I don't think that a composable architecture is inherently more complex than a monolithic one. It's just that you can see the complexity for yourself with the composable approach. So it's still there with a monolith. It's just you don't see it, and you don't have any control or power to really fix things when they go wrong. So that's why I think it's a lot more important to have that when something goes wrong answer in like the monolithic world than it is in the composable world.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Well, Adam, we're pretty much out of time. This has been a great 2-part series. I thank you for it. I do want to remind viewers, if it's prior to November 15th, on November 15th, go to our, we're having a DXC assembly conference, mini conference. You can find out more information at uniform.to/DXCA-HC as in Headless Creator. Go check that out, and if it's post November 15th, I think the stuff will be available on demand, I'm assuming, so they can go check that out. If people want to get a hold of you, Adam, that email right there is it?
Yep, that's where I'm at.
Adam, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks again, Marcelo.
And I know you're my boss. I don't have to say that, but it truly has been a pleasure.
Well, likewise, and really, I appreciate having the chance to come and talk with you like that. It's been great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you really enjoyed this episode of the Discover Headless Tech podcast. I know I have. It's been a lot of fun. Learned a lot of stuff. And stay tuned for many more. We have lots of episodes, lots of tutorials, lots of other things coming on. So until the next one, have a great one, everybody.